visit master in Bali. Some were decorated with human hair, 24 carat gold, or the tusks of wild fish in Sumatra. Comang Mega carved certain masks only during a full moon, sometimes working at the temple, where he also has his tools blessed regularly. He says he's been working 1 or 2 days a month on these masks, for the rest of the lunar cycle, he carves masks not destined for sacred ritual, suitcases of tourists supports his lifestyle. The irony is that it could be tourism itself which threatens the tradition of mask making in Bali, as well as other artisanal crafts, textiles, stone carving, basket weaving, and silversmithing. These days, my friends are not choosing mask making, even if they come from families of mask makers, he told me. Even my friend whose grandfather's a maestro. He said that the salary of his friends working in tourism, serving in a restaurant or a villa, is 2 million rupiah per month, $123 US, which is 4 times what he earns. Are you tempted to shift? I asked. He shook his head vigorously. I love what I do. There's big money working in a restaurant, but it doesn't make you happy. He added how, during COVID, he'd been able to go on working, unlike friends who lost their jobs when tourists stopped coming to Bali. He used social media to showcase his skills, procuring commissions from all over the world. I sent masks to America, to Australia, to Singapore, he said. He's continued this since the pandemic. The noise of a scooter engine interrupted us, and we turned to see his brother and sister-in-law driving off carrying offerings. She was dressed in a kabaya, a traditional lace blouse. He wore an udeng, a carefully tied headdress, knotted at the forehead, which symbolises the focus of the mind. They're going to the temple, Comang Mega told me. This is our life. Comang Mega is a temple dancer as well as a mask maker. He gave me a demonstration, fitting one mask after another to his face, becoming the characters. Wearing the first mask with its buck teeth and bared gums, he grunted like a pig, crabbing around the room. Then, wearing a mask of an elderly man with bushy eyebrows, he developed a stooped walk, smoothing down his grey moustache. And he finished with my favourite, a mask painted mid-yawn, mouth agape. Good morning, Bali. He bathed sleepily, stretching his arms. Everything I make has the energy of my hands, he said, the energy of character. No machines. I'm proud of them, but I'm worried too. Tourists come for clubbing, not for temples and traditional dances. If they want a mask as a souvenir, most buy a cheap one in the shopping mall. He's teaching his daughter his craft. She's 4, the same age he was when he began sandpapering his father's masks. His little girl has appeared on his Insta reel, painting a mask. A testament, perhaps, to how Comang Mega is trying to press on with age-old traditions in a fast-changing world.
Michelle Ganachan. And that's all for this program. I'm Max Pearson. The producer was Polly Hope. You can hear more stories, including tales of the stinging anti-tourism backlash being felt in Spain on From Our Own Correspondent podcast. And we'll be back again next weekend here on the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, where Will Grant is telling the story of Las Patronas.
Hungry migrants risk death by clinging onto La Bestia, the Beast, a freight train on its way to the US border. As it speeds through a small Mexican town, the women, known as Las Patronas, throw food parcels to them. They feed hundreds every day, and they've been doing it for almost 30 years.
As we started, we could stop helping.
But it's not just hunger the migrants face. Every one of us have their own reasons for traveling, for leaving their country.
And traveling without papers, 1,001 things can happen to you.
There's the threat of robbery and beatings, even kidnapped by the cartels.
Las Patronas, Thursday at 8:30 and 19 GMT.
In an era of information overload, it's hard to gain a deeper understanding of the stories that matter to us all.
50 times the energy use of all of humankind is carried in this conveyor belt of heat.
I'm Claire Graham, and I'll be talking to the BBC's climate editor, Justin Rowlett, about the Atlantic Ocean conveyor belt of heat, which, if weakened due to climate change, may disrupt monsoon seasons throughout the world. In the explanation after the news.
BBC News with Chris Barrow. Israel's Prime Minister is cutting shorter visits to the United States in the wake of a deadly rocket attack on the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Benjamin Netanyahu warned the Lebanese group Hezbollah that it would pay a heavy price for the attack on the Druze Arab area of Majd al-Shams. Hezbollah has denied any involvement. Donald Trump has told a Bitcoin conference in the United States that he would champion cryptocurrency if elected in November. His likely Democratic Party opponent in the election, Kamala Harris, has described herself as the underdog. Tuareg rebels have said they've inflicted big losses on government forces and Russian mercenaries in northern Mali. They said dozens had been killed during 2 days of clashes near the Algerian border. The army said only 2 of its soldiers had died. South Korea's military is investigating a leak of the personal information of agents at an intelligence unit that spies on North Korea. The leak was first detected about a month ago. The biggest wildfire to hit California this year is continuing to spread rapidly. The Park Fire, which began near the city of Chico, has almost doubled in size since Friday. The US Treasury Secretary has announced a joint initiative with a number of South American countries to disrupt illicit activities that harm the Amazon rainforest. Speaking in the Brazilian city of Belém, Janet Yellen said illegal mining and the smuggling of wildlife and plants generated hundreds of billions of dollars each year. Reports from Japan suggest that Mitsubishi is to join an alliance between 2 of its bigger rivals, Honda and Nissan. The Japanese car industry is trying to become more competitive in the electric vehicle market. At the Olympic Games in Paris, Australia are leading the medals table after the first full day of competition. They've dominated the early swimming events. That's the latest BBC News.
So, how did it happen?
Well, actually, that's a really important question.
The 2 countries were essentially enemies. That is, of course, an allegation that has been leveled.
Everybody has a different definition of what the problem was.
Let's remember the background of all this.
Hello, I'm Claire Graham. Welcome to The Explanation from the BBC World Service, where we ask the big questions and try to get you the answers.
I might feel a bit seasick, but that I live with.
Greta Thunberg is sailing to New York for a UN climate summit of world leaders. She wants the trip to be as low carbon as possible.
On every continent and across the oceans, climate change is being felt. That's the conclusion of the latest UN report.
The cold blob. It sounds like something in a horror film, but it's actually very real, and it's sitting in the Atlantic, about the size of Western Europe.
In recent years, Discovery's been involved in deploying a string of sensors across the Atlantic that measures the ocean currents, the warm waters flowing north and the deeper cold waters flowing south. Predictions are that the force of this circulation could decline, with dramatic consequences for our weather.
Justin Rowlett, the BBC's first ever climate editor. Welcome to The Explanation.
Thank you, Claire. I'm delighted to be on.
Okay, well, let's begin by talking about something called AMOC and the Gulf Stream. Can you tell us what they are?
AMOC is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and the Gulf Stream is one part of this great circulatory system in the Atlantic Ocean. We're talking about surface water drawn up from the South Atlantic that travels all the way across the tropical regions and then up across the North Atlantic, across the ocean from America across eastward up towards the coast of Europe and then up into the Arctic Ocean, where the water sinks, cools and sinks down and becomes what is essentially a great cold river running about 2 or 3 kilometres beneath the surface. So the entire area of the Atlantic Ocean is affected by this. It carries a vast amount of heat. It's about 50 times the energy use of all humankind, which is carried in this conveyor belt of heat up across the Atlantic. And because the transfer of heat is so vast, that affects weather systems not just immediately in the environment around the Atlantic Ocean, but all around the world. And when you look at the impact that it has on the world, it explains why the Northern Hemisphere, you may not know this, but the Northern Hemisphere is a little bit warmer than the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, it's quite a lot in global terms, 1.4 degrees Celsius warmer. That's because of the drawing heat up from the south.
How does AWOC and the Gulf Stream work?
So how does it work? Well, this is where it gets a tiny bit complicated. Hopefully I'll be able to kind of, work my way through it and we'll all understand what we're talking about. So we're talking initially, let's start on the surface. So the warm surface water in AWOC is a little bit more salty than most seawater. Now that's because as it travels up from the south into the warmer tropic, some of the water evaporates, and that means the water in this surface flow is a bit more concentrated, and that is important because salty water, saline water as the scientists would call it, is a bit heavier than fresh water. Now as it travels north, the winds whip across it, drawing out the heat, delivering that heat into the atmosphere, so the water slowly, gradually cools down. And this process of taking heat out of this warm surface water is why the North Atlantic region is so much warmer than you would expect at its latitude. So this heavy salty water is getting colder. Colder water is heavier than warm water. So what happens is, as it gets into the chilly Arctic, it starts to sink. It's salty, it's cold, it's heavy, it sinks down, and this is the engine that drives the flow. So this delivers that. We talk about the river of cold water running deep below the surface of the Atlantic, and this is where it sinks down and begins that process of travelling back down south. So that is the process, the combination of heat and salinity and saltiness.
What does that system do for the likes of weather systems around the world?
Weather is all about the distribution of heat. Weather is all about warm air moving towards colder places to try and even out the heat distribution on Earth. So I've already talked about how it explains why the Northern Hemisphere is warmer, very particularly because the winds typically blow towards the east as the warm water in the surface is drawn out and picked up by the air. It's blown into Europe, and it's why Europe is significantly warmer at the same latitude than, for example, in Canada. So Canada, we know, is really, really cold in winter. Europe is much more moderate, and that is because of this great transfer of heat. And that pattern of heat distribution affects weather systems throughout the world.
And Justin, there's a whole underworld of marine life under the water. I'm wondering how much do they rely on this system?
I mean, it's really important. Obviously, many marine creatures, they are where they are because they're used to being at that temperature. So they're there because, for example, water's a bit warmer than elsewhere, or a bit cooler. In fact, this is the species that we are familiar with in Europe with both cold water. So it determines where species live. It also helps determine how much oxygen there is in the water. It distributes oxygen, so oxygen that's taken up in the surface water is then delivered to the depths through the circulatory system. So all sorts of impacts on marine life and ecosystems. And the other way to look at it, of course, is that life has got used to the pattern of distribution in the oceans that we have at the moment. And if that changes, that represents a massive change.
These beluga whales, they're swimming in water that's much hotter than it used to be. And all wildlife here in Svalbard is having to adapt to this hotter world. You can hear them now. It's hotter in the water, and it's hotter in the Arctic.
This is the explanation from the BBC World Service. I'm Claire Graham, and I'm asking why ocean currents in the Atlantic Ocean called AWOC and the Gulf Stream are so vital to regulating our climate. With Justin Rowlett, the BBC's climate editor.
The fear is that climate change is changing the nature of water in the Northern region, and that could be slowing the engine.
Over the last 100 years, temperatures have been on the rise, and the Arctic could have ice-free summers by 2050.
But the glaciers, they are melting all over the world. That's something which we really cannot ignore.
So what scientists are worried about is the increasingly rapid melt of Arctic ice, and also an increasing amount of rainfall in northern latitudes is delivering more fresh water into the Arctic Ocean. Now, fresh water is lighter, even if it's cold, it's lighter than seawater at the same temperature because, of course, it doesn't have any salt. We're back to that temperature and salinity aspect of AMOC. And that lighter, fresher water, if it mixes with the AMOC flow, the water becomes less dense, less dense water is less heavy water, and therefore less prone to sink. And remember, that sinking of the cold, dense salty water was the engine that drove the whole system. So the worry is that salty, cold engine that drives the process could slow down, could even stop, and sometimes is worried the system could include what they call a tipping point, a point at which suddenly the system, rather than continuing, develops a tendency to go the other way and abruptly slow down or even stop, and that process could be irreversible.
So what would be...
So what sort of things might happen? Well, we've already seen that northern Europe is warmer than it would be, thanks to AMOC and the Gulf Stream, part of AMOC. So we'd expect that to get significantly colder. We'd also expect southern Europe to get a bit drier. We'd expect the temperature difference between northern and southern Europe to increase dramatically, could be by as much as 4 degrees Celsius. Now that would mean huge instability in weather in Europe and could drive huge storms. Other weird things might happen, like the sea level on the US coast will rise significantly because at the moment the current draws water across the Atlantic and up into the north, and the flow of water is so great that it actually draws water away from the coast of America. So if that process slows, there'll be less drawing the water away, and the water would therefore rise on the coast of the US. But perhaps the most important, the most significant impacts would be elsewhere in the world, because this process, the warmth delivered in the air, the warmth and moisture delivered by AMOC, is a key determinant of tropical monsoons. In Africa specifically, but also in Asia. And the fear is that a significant change in AMOC flow could shift the pattern of monsoon rain, and that could cause massive changes in agricultural productivity and also in ecosystems. So rainforests, for example, in Africa, are there because there is regular rain, and if that rain shifts somewhere else, the rainforest dry and becomes savanna. So there could be huge changes around the world. I mean, climate scientists say this is one of the changes that could constitute a planetary disaster. It could be a really huge impact on the world's weather systems and on all of us.
Well, when we look at the science of this, how likely is that to happen? What do we know about the data behind this and those sorts of projections?
That is such a good question, and this is where we have a big problem because we simply don't have much data on AMOC. It's a huge process covering huge areas of the ocean, and we haven't had the wherewithal or indeed the recognition of the CERN group until very recently. The fact that there was this cold river running deep in the Atlantic was only discovered in the middle of the 18th century. But what's interesting when you look at that is even the fact that there's so much cold water passing over the surface of the ocean is going to be really important. That's going to be a very important role in weather and climate. So they did think this is important, what we've discovered, but they weren't able to research the consequences. In fact, there have only been a few cross-Atlantic voyages.
In recent years, Discovery's been involved in deploying a string of sensors across the Atlantic from Morocco to the Bahamas. The Rapid Array, as it's known, measures the ocean currents, the warm waters flowing north and the deeper cold waters flowing south. Predictions are that the force of this circulation could decline, with dramatic consequences for our weather.
One of the things we know about AMOC is that it is in itself variable anyway between years and between decades. So you've only got a couple of decades of data and you know it's variable. Your data isn't super reliable. That said, studies have shown that there is quite strong evidence that AMOC is slowing and has been slowing since the 1930s. Some scientists say by perhaps as much as 15%. Doesn't sound like much, but remember, this is a vast process of heat transfer and therefore very important. And there's another kind of bit of evidence that people point to. There's a guy called Professor Stefan Ramsdorf of Potsdam University who works with an American climate scientist called Michael Mann. They've been looking at the appearance of what they call a cold blob. So a blob, an area, it's actually a blob, it's a huge area of colder water south of Greenland. And what they've noticed is that as the rest of the world has been warming over the last few decades, this area has got colder. And they say that could be because AMOC isn't delivering as much heat as it was to that region, and that could be, they say, because the AMOC is slowing. So there are some strands of evidence suggesting it's slowing, but there's a huge degree of uncertainty. And the UN's climate science body, so the UN gets together loads of leading climate scientists. They trawl through all the climate science papers that have been published. And this group of climate scientists are saying there's medium confidence that the AMOC will not slow. It's quite interesting though, when you speak to the climate scientists who research AMOC, they say, well, okay, fair enough, the evidence isn't there. But they say, look, this is really important. As we said, it's potentially a planetary scale disaster, and just being moderately confident that it's not going to happen in the next 75 years isn't enough.
Do we know if AMOC has stopped and restarted before, say for example within the ice ages?
That's a really good question, and there is evidence that that's happened. They call it paleoclimatic evidence, looking at kind of ice cores in ancient ice in glaciers in the Arctic and elsewhere. And they also take cores of the sediment on the floor of the ocean, and they can use those as a proxy to look at the sort of temperature and flows of water and that kind of thing. And there is some evidence that AMOC has faltered, has slowed in the past, and they believe there is some evidence that it may even have stopped in Earth's history. So there is evidence that this has happened before, which again gives credence to the idea that it could be slowing now. So there is a whole collection of evidence pointing towards the fact that there could be changes in this system, and also, of course, that any changes in the system could have huge impacts worldwide and are therefore really, really important things for us to consider when we think about the reasons why it's important to tackle climate change.
Do you find that the nations who are projected to be impacted the most, say for example you mentioned the weather systems in Africa or in Asia, the monsoon seasons, do they shout louder about this?
Mostly, Claire, it's the scientists who agitate action on this.
The report clearly shows. When the report was unveiled at a press conference here in South Korea, it came with a startling conclusion.
If action is not taken, it will take the planet into an unprecedented climate future if we compare it to what has happened during all of human evolutionary history.
I mean, the problem is that governments aren't good at distant, uncertain threats like climate change in general, but specifically AMOC slowing. That's not something that governments tend to be able to focus on because they've got more immediate concerns. And so what you've got is scientists saying, kind of shouting, waving their arms, listen guys, we've got to take this seriously.
What is the global solution to control this, or at least limit change?
We need to cut the amount of greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere, and that predominantly means using far less fossil fuels, reducing our use as quickly as we can, and also stopping deforestation, which is a driver as well. So if we can do those things, but those are massive challenges. If we can do those things, we stand a chance of kind of lessening the risk that we're going to
Justin, what is it like to be the BBC's first climate?
Well, on the one hand, the science is quite depressing, but on the other hand, in my view, it is having a future environment that our descendants live in, not just for hundreds of years, but for thousands of years, right? What happens in the next 5-10 years will help determine all our descendants' futures. So it's absolutely crucial. This is what we'll be judged on. Our great-great-grandchildren will look back and they'll be thinking, well, what did you guys do? And there are solutions. We have the technologies. I mean, it's an extraordinary coincidence. As we come to realise climate change is happening, we also have the technologies that help us do it, and that represents an industrial revolution, right? A huge change in the way we do everything. So that makes it exciting. That means if you're looking in the future what kind of job you want to do, you should be thinking about renewable energy, because there are going to be loads and loads of new jobs in that. So I think, like, on the one hand, the science is quite depressing, but I think there's incredible societal, global opportunity here to make a better world for ourselves.
Thanks to my guest, Justin Rowland. You've been listening to The Explanation from the BBC World Service with me, Claire Green.
Hello and welcome to Sporting Witness with me, Jack Butcher. Today, I'm taking you back to 2004, when a breaking news story threatened to overshadow the opening of the Athens Olympics. It's August 2004, and in Athens, Greece, final preparations are being made to host the 28th Olympic Games.
Frantic preparations, days and nights working around the clock to just meet all these deadlines that involve from logistics to organization to actual construction of venues.
Athens-based journalist Carlos Groman has spent the past 4 years covering events for the news agency Reuters.
The whole country shifted towards that project in one way or another. It was, in a way, a very big project for Greece to project itself internationally as a modern, successful European nation.
Despite the practical challenges, excitement is building in Greece for what has been hailed as the Olympics returning home. Not only was Greece the birthplace of the ancient Olympic Games, but Athens also hosted the first modern Olympics in 1896.
Greece's Olympic Mama. It's a French pattern, Cœur de Coubertin, but it's a Greek idea.
Athens-born windsurfer Nikos Kaklamanikis, next 8 years earlier, now aged 35, he's delayed thoughts of retirement to compete in his home city games.
Since I was a kid, I was dreaming 5 Olympic cycles, but all this happening in your home country, it brings a new dimension.
For Kaklamanikis, the homecoming is extra special, as he has been selected as one of the torchbearers to carry the Olympic flame during the opening ceremony.
The torch relay this time around was worldwide. The message, the deep values of the Olympic Games is that if we can play together, we can live together.
Amongst the Greek public, there is a tangible buzz of anticipation after their national team's surprise victory at the Euro 2004 Football Championships a month earlier.
That had triggered the first tsunami of enthusiasm. And then expecting and anticipating success at the Olympics just added to that sporting frenzy.
But then, on Thursday, August the 12th, the eve of the Olympic opening ceremony, everything was thrown into disarray. News began to break concerning 2 of Greece's biggest sporting stars.
Late in the evening, I got a call from our police stringer who said, listen, there's been an accident. And the accident involved Kenteris and family.
Sprinter Kostas Kenteris had stunned the world 4 years earlier in Sydney by storming to Olympic gold in the 200 metres. Training partner Katerina Fanu had won silver in the 100 metres.
They were household names in Greece. Kenteris had a high-speed ferry named after him. Squares and streets were named after them, and they were expected to be the faces of these Olympics.
Reports were also emerging that the 2 sprinters had both missed a mandatory doping test. Details were still hazy as the world's media scrambled to work out what was going on.
As the night progressed, we found out that testers had tried to locate them at the Olympic Village where they were supposed to be. They were not there. They were at their coach's house, and allegedly they got on a motorcycle to rush back to the Olympic Village. An accident occurred. That triggered a whole chain of events, with them landing in hospital.
The emerging scandal was a huge embarrassment for Olympic officials.
Drugs and doping are threatening to overshadow the opening of the Olympic. The host nation's top stars are being pressed to explain why they missed a drug test.
For Greece, this is already a hugely damaging episode.
Greece's star sprinters now face the spectre of being expelled from their own games.
These weren't the 2 athletes' first missed tests.
And that's where the information in the months leading up to the Olympics about alleged missed tests or no-shows came into play.
developing news story also raised questions about the much anticipated opening ceremony, which was now less than 24 hours away.
There was a lot of rumors and speculation that Candaris would be the last torchbearer and the one to light the flame in the Olympic Stadium.
While the identity of the final torchbearer remains a closely guarded secret ahead of every Olympic opening ceremony, unbeknown to Grohmann and the rest of the world, a last-minute change had swiftly been made.
The day before the opening ceremony, while I'm training, the motorboat comes next to me full speed with a phone in their hand. I'm full wet, I'm gasping for air like what is it about? The president of the organizing committee wants to talk to you, and then she asks me, please go for rehearsals, the sooner the better, immediately if possible. You are the last torchbearer. Say thank you, but I have a training schedule to finish. I cannot leave the water. And then she replies to me, have you realized you are the last torchbearer and there will be billions of people watching you live?
The opening ceremony for the 2004 Olympic Games will get underway in Athens. It's estimated that around 4 billion people around the world will watch.
The following morning, the day of the opening ceremony itself, the world's media was still trying to piece together conflicting accounts of the two sprinters' missed doping tests.
I understand that the Greek athletes will probably argue that they can't be held culpable because they were not properly informed that they were due to turn up for a drugs test, and there are those who say that that could be a strong defence.
But Kaklamanikis was determined to shut out all the noise.
I was blocking things out totally because I wanted to breathe, sleep during the purpose that I was demanded to deliver.
Come the evening, it was time to step out in front of the eyes of the world in the 72,000 capacity crowd in the Athens Olympic Stadium, dressed all in white. Kaklamanikis looked on as his fellow torchbearers relayed the Olympic torch towards him.
With all the low lighting and only the light of the Olympic flame, it was something majestic, a spiritual kind of moment for me.
Finally, the penultimate runner passed the torch to Kaklamanikis, who set off jogging towards the dozens of temporary steps to the Olympic cauldron.
The further up you go, the more there is a tendency of the top of the sturts to come back and forth, and the more the chance for you to trip. I remember what is my motto while riding a very big wave. Orthios, Nicola, orthios. Stay on your feet, stay on your feet. And then in the end, yes, thank you, done.
You're standing there on top of the steps and the torches then going up. When you're looking around the stadium, what's going through your head?
I have to confess, coming especially from a sport, you're out in the ocean alone. There's a huge contradiction coming to the biggest stadium of the world, like the Olympic Games, at your home spot. And to be honest, I felt for seconds that I was in the top of the world, on the top of the planet.
With the Olympics officially underway, the sword of Damocles continued to hang over the two Greek sprinters as they remained in hospital for 5 days. Ultimately, on August the 18th, Kenteris and Fanu announced their withdrawal from the Olympics.
There was anger, bitterness, frustration. There was also anger at the athletes that they put themselves in that position.
Both sprinters served a 2-year ban from athletics for missing doping tests, while related legal proceedings would drag on for years to come.
It has left a bitter aftertaste. Still, most Greeks will remember that time as a very, very successful time for their country.
For one Greek in particular, it was an experience he will never forget. After lighting the Olympic cauldron, Nikos Kaklamanikis went on to secure a silver medal at Athens 2004.
If you tell me, would you like an Olympic gold medal at this Olympics or a silver? And the great honor of being the last torchbearer, I would say the second scenario is way better. It was a moment that belonged to the Olympism and Greece. The long-term, lasting values of the Olympic Games, symbolized by the flame, were so much higher to be represented by a single person. I was just a carrier in the end.
Nikos Kaklamanikis, ending that edition of Sporting Witness. It was presented by me, Jack Butcher, and it was a Whistledown production for the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service. The documentary brings you in-depth storytelling from teams at the BBC World Service.
journeys into the heart of global events.
We bring people together to share their experiences,
explore personal approaches to faith,
in-depth reporting on the world of social media,
gets into the mind of some of the world's most creative people.
The documentary at bbcworldservice.com or wherever you get your BBC podcasts. In 30 minutes, the documentary.
Join me, Divya Arya, as I visit a school training young girls to be the next wrestling champions, so they can one day bring gold medals back home.
Stay with us. The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is Alex Ritson with the newsroom. A deadly rocket strike on young people playing football in the occupied Golan Heights prompts Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu to cut short a visit to the US.
As soon as I arrive, I will immediately convene the Security Cabinet. I can say that the state of Israel will not let this pass in silence. We will not overlook this.
Donald Trump's message changes little even after the Biden-Harris switch.
6 days ago, we officially defeated the worst president in the history of the United States, crooked Joe Biden. And we have a new victim now, Kamala.
Hosts France take the Rugby Sevens gold medal on the first day of the Paris Olympics. Venezuela's opposition hopes for a presidential election win after years of repression, and not just any bikini. It was Princess Leia's, and it's been sold for a lot of money.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is cutting short a visit to the United States in the wake of a deadly rocket attack on the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. 12 people aged between 10 and 20 were killed in the Druze Arab area of Majd al-Shams when a football pitch was hit. Mr. Netanyahu warned the Lebanese group Hezbollah that it would pay a heavy price. Hezbollah has denied any involvement. Paul Adams is in Jerusalem.
This is precisely what people have been worried about, have been fearing for the past 10 months.